welcome to this ASME Bite Size. As you know, we're looking a little bit at how to deliver remote large group teaching. We're thinking a little bit about what have we learned from our experiences, what are the potential opportunities with remote teaching, what does the scholarship tell us? And as we mentioned in the last session, our goal is to just get a bit of a conversation going around the sort of the ASME community around large group teaching. So that's the plan. We're going to be about 45 minutes is the plan this evening. A few sort of general housekeeping notes before we kick off. We want to get you involved, so please ask questions. We've had some questions come in advance, but do use the chat function. The chat function is available on the bottom of the screen with a little speech bubble. So if you want to click on that, ask your question. If we don't have time to answer all of your questions, we'll be collecting those questions up and we'll try and answer at a later time any that we're unable to address this evening. So you're welcome to share comments, contribute to the conversation. If you've got particular experiences, you want to share things with the wider group, then do let us know. We may invite some of you. If that's the case, we'll send you a message on the chat function asking, do you want to have your video on? Are you happy to use audio? Are you happy to go live? If you could just respond to us if you're happy to do that, and we can then help you to join as a temporary panelist. Just to say this webinar is being recorded, and so the ASME team will be putting this up on the ASME website with other support materials to link in with the pre-recorded session that many of you will have been watching. If you did have any technical problems, the office is there to help you. So do give them an email. They're on events@asme.org.uk. You'll have probably received a confirmation email from them anyway about this evening. So do respond to them. They're there, they're live. They can help you out with any technical issues during the course of the evening. So that's just a little bit of housekeeping to kick us off. Let's introduce ourselves. So I'm Mark Lillicrap. I'm a rheumatology consultant, partly here in Cambridge, partly in Huntingdon. I'm the curriculum sub-dean for the university here in Cambridge, and I work with Jeremy and Claire doing staff development work and deliver quite a lot of large group teaching and have had to do quite a lot of large group teaching remotely around musculoskeletal stuff, around immunology, around professional practice. So that's a bit of my background. Claire, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi everybody, my name is Clare Morris. I happen to be chair of the ASME Educational Research Committee, but today I'm here as a colleague of Mark and Jeremy because I work part-time for the University of Cambridge, where I lead on the Masters and PG Dip in medical education and co-facilitate lots of the certificate with Jeremy. I'm an honorary professor of med ed at Barts in the London also, and I'm really interested in getting behind the kind of teaching methods that we use and doing a little bit thinking about, well, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? How do we make sure the best possible learning happens in these circumstances? And what are the workarounds when we're doing things like lecturing, which don't, in my opinion, don't naturally lend themselves to good learning without quite a lot of effort from the facilitator. So glad to be part of the conversation this afternoon.
Jeremy.
Yeah, I'm Jeremy Webb. I work with Mark. I'm a sub-dean at the clinical school in Cambridge. My background is in fact general practice, where I was a trainer, and I've also I do teaching still with graduate medical students mainly, rather than the undergraduate ones. And we've done quite a lot of large group teaching with them, as well as weekly seminars and tutorials with them online. So like all of you, I'm learning as we're going along. So 4 months ago, I'd never heard of Zoom. And now here we are trying to share practice. So I think we're very much talking about the lessons we've learned so far, and I think there are probably a lot more for us to learn.
Absolutely.
So that's who we are. We'd love you all to be contributing. So if you've got any questions at all, do start utilising the chat function. We'll come on to those in a second. Just to get you thinking again, just to remind you a bit about some of the stuff that we covered in the pre-recorded session. Hopefully this will just trigger a little bit of thinking for you. So we thought to start with in the pre-recorded session about how would we currently advise somebody to deliver a lecture-based teaching program, picking up on what Claire said. It's quite challenging to deliver effective learning in a large group setting. So how could we do that? And we thought a little bit about what are the benefits of lectures, what are the challenges, and what are the challenges of translating that into a remote context, and how would we teach somebody to do that? Claire then talked us through a little bit about the scholarship and challenged us, as she's just mentioned, why would we do this? Why do large group teaching? And we thought a little bit about what does the evidence tell us about large group teaching and its benefits, thinking about it as a social learning event and how can you replicate that social experience remotely, the importance of modeling and how do you model thinking, particularly in that sort of large group kind of context, how do you develop cooperative learning, how do you challenge students to take responsibility for their own learning in that kind of large group session. Jeremy then got us thinking a little bit about some of the practical elements, thinking about process ahead of content and the importance of thinking about the process, thinking about those three key elements, the before, the during, and the after, and how you can structure remote teaching using that. We thought a little bit about the importance of embedding time for discussions, utilizing resources such as breakout rooms, thinking about allowing time for reflection and note-taking, and not being afraid as somebody who's facilitating a large group teaching on Zoom or other remote platforms. Don't be afraid of the silence. Sometimes actually you need to allow for a bit of silence. We then looked at some practical tips, picking up on what Jeremy's just said, largely around some of the mistakes we've made. So we're not here to tell you what to do. We're learning just like everyone else is. So we thought about the benefits of live versus pre-recorded sessions. We mentioned about having a notepad next to your screen so you can make notes as you're going through about things that you want to come back to. The benefits of co-facilitating, sharing the load, allowing somebody else to monitor the chat function and the like. We talked about kinds of resources that are available out there through groups like Medical Schools Council. We thought about simple things like, standing up. If you're delivering large group teaching can be beneficial. And if you hide your video, that's one of the benefits, the importance of using good technology in terms of microphones. And then we finished by highlighting, we're not here to tell you what to do and say, this is how you must do it. We're here to share our thoughts. We're here to get a conversation going, because at the end of the day, we want to deliver the most effective education that we can with these remote teaching processes. So we need to discuss that, get other people's experiences, other people's advice, and see what other people have learned from the whole experience. So that was where we were up to, and hopefully you've all had the chance to watch the sort of pre-session bite size. One resource we mentioned last time was things like Slido and Mentimeter. I'm just going to hand over to Claire, who's just going to get you thinking a little bit about what do I think about large group teaching by just modeling that Slido for us. Over to you, Claire.
So I'm going to do the thing that always strikes fear in my heart when I'm doing large group work and remote work, is rely on the technology. But I think it's about, it kind of links to a wider question around how do you foster interaction with your learners when you're remote, and also when there's lots of them, and not getting too hung up on having to do it in one particular way. So I'm just going to share my screen, and which I don't know if any of you have used Slido before, but it's an interactive tool that you can use. So this would be, so if I just put this up there just now, so what you have to do is you go to slido.com and you put in the number to join the event. You don't use the hashtag, it's very confusing, but you go to slido.com and you put in the number to access a space basically that's that you can put some predetermined questions in. So my predetermined question is, how do you feel about facilitating remote lectures? So if any of you are game enough to either go on your phone or your computer, your tablet, whatever you've got available to you, log into slido.com, put in the number 58531, and then this will activate a word cloud. Thank you very much. Somebody feels terrified. Okay.
The other thing they can do, which I did, it was me that put terrified, is just scan the QR code. It takes you there automatically.
Excellent, thank you. And so I'm going to keep this running in the background,
Okay.
as those of you who haven't had a go yet have a go. Because
and
what
so
it will...
whilst that's up and running, we'll start picking up one or two of the questions. We've had some questions coming in advance. One of the questions was around, should we be doing these kind of things using learning management systems? And what are the pros and cons of using a learning management system for delivery of remote large group teaching? So Claire, did you want to comment a bit on learning management systems?
Yeah, so for me, learning management systems are things like Moodle and Blackboard and virtual learning environments, or places and spaces where you can gather together resources and materials for students. And I think it's, as always in education, it's a bit of a, it depends. So I would say if you are fortunate enough to have access to a learning management system, it certainly allows you to think quite creatively about the different kinds of online material that you might use. So in the prep work, Jeremy talked about the before, during and after method we're using at Cambridge. So you can actually put things up there for the students to read or to watch or discuss, if it's got a discussion board and so on beforehand. You can put your recorded sessions up there, whether you're doing a pre-record or record live, and then they go back to. And certainly when we've used this, we use Moodle, or a version of Moodle at Cambridge, for the postgraduate courses in medical education. And students have really appreciated that when we moved over to much more of a blended approach when the pandemic hit and we were doing live sessions on Zoom or pre-record. They really valued the fact it was curated, it was signposted, they could go back and look at things, we could make strong connections between what we were teaching about and what they'd already done. So I think it can work really well, but I think also you need to be pragmatic. So if you're doing a one-off with a group of people you haven't met before, or a group of students you won't teach again, to be honest, you might be better just using your platform, sharing resources in the chat tool, or emailing round, or a WhatsApp group. So I think sometimes we worry a bit about the technology rather than what is it we're actually trying to do and what is the easiest way. And also, from an open access way, the more complicated we make it for our students, the more assumption we're making about the kinds of tools that they have access to, the technology they're able to use. So that was my thinking. I think it can add real value, but you can do it without having to use a learning platform.
And I think learning management systems can be advantageous in terms of curating content. So it enables you as a teacher to control information. It can be password protected. That can enable you, particularly in terms of clinical images and things, to control the way that people access things. And it enables you to track who's logging on and how they're doing it. I think one of the concerns about some of the learning management systems is they are very sort of course centric, and what we're often looking to do, as Claire picked up last time, is actually challenge students in terms of self-direction, and actually a curated learning management system that gives them all the resources that they need, that works them through everything that could possibly be required, actually has the risk of undermining that slightly. So I think there are pros and cons to learning management systems, that it depends what's good for different people. Jeremy?
I think the other thing about them is it probably disciplines you as the teacher to make sure you think about the process before the content, and it allows you to reduce content and feel confident. So you can just refer back to it. So I think that's something for me. I've always planned content and then thought about process. I've been persuaded by Claire to go the other way around.
Nagging over all the decades.
I think that picks up the question that we've got on the chat, in terms of how do you manage 400 students in an online kind of environment, and I think part of that is about thinking, what's the process, necessarily what the content is, but how's the process going to work here that enables 400 students to get that social experience whilst learning, whilst being in some way self-directed. Jeremy, did you want to answer anything about that sort of, how do you manage 400 students with that sort of flipped classroom approach?
Well, that was actually when I saw that, that was when I put the terrified comment up, because I'm lucky enough not to have to deal with 400 at once. I had to deal last week with 40 at once. And I think that the thing I've learned, there are a number of things I've learned. One is I think actually it is worth putting stuff up before you deliver. So I think the whole before, during and after, thinking about that process is really important, because you have to let go a bit, and you can't deliver everything during a session. It's just not possible. I think breaking your content up is really important. So aliquots of content and then periodic stops. I think with that number, you must have at least one other facilitator, and probably more than that. And certainly somebody else to monitor chat. We've now got to the stage where we've delivered some of our content virtually for our graduate students, and then got them to give evaluation. And the thing that they've come up with is they don't particularly, interesting enough, they didn't find the breakout rooms, the students, as good as we thought they were. They found them a bit pointless. Now, I think that's probably just the way we did it. But I think they also find it quite difficult if you ask them questions directly, because it puts them on the spot. So I think get them to put questions in chat, and then get somebody to pick up on that chat. And then what I did last week was I actually asked them if they were okay to unmute and expand on what they'd written up. Yeah. So I think that works quite well. But you ask them permission to do that rather than just doing it directly.
Yeah.
And
can I ask that, Mark? So yeah. I was thinking about some of the things I've done with large groups. Don't think I've quite hit 400, but certainly done it with in the hundreds. I think I go back to some of my guiding principles for lectures anyway. So my first guiding principle for any lecture is, what can I offer that a textbook can't? So I think thinking really wisely about, if I've got an hour with these students to work with them, what am I going to offer them that they won't get out of a textbook? Because that's likely to engage them more anyway and have them on the edge of their seats a bit more. So often that's about how you bring the clinical into the classroom, how you lean into your lived experience, how you've got stories of patients and situations. We talked on the pre-record about finding resources that you can share. So things like patient voices, which are first-person stories. Jeremy talked, I can't remember the name of the resource, which is a whole load of speaking clinically, so you can do that kind of thing. The risk with large numbers and students can get a bit silly, I think is the kindest way to put this, is you might want to manage the chat separate from the platform that everybody can see. So if everybody can see this chat, something like Slido, and I don't have shares, it's just one I use, you can choose when you share what's on there, so they don't have to see it. So basically you can screen and monitor what's coming from the students, and you can group that together. I personally think breakout rooms work really well, but you have to kind of let go of control a little bit. So just because you put them in a group doesn't mean you then have to go to every group and ask them what they talked about. So you might want to think a little creatively about how you do that. But again, those things like inviting them to speak, inviting them to have a role, can help as well. But I would always go back to, what is the point of doing this? What can I offer in this that I can't offer by giving them something to read? That would be my best advice.
Yeah,
if other people have ideas, please put them in chat, because we're here to grab your ideas too.
There's an interesting one from Jay McDougall. What else can you do to make online sessions more interactive? And I think following up on the breakout rooms, one of the things I think works really well is, if you're teaching about clinical things, is to actually give them scenarios to deal with. We've done this for the postgraduate certificate. It worked really well last week with the clinical cases. So I actually gave each group 3 questions with a clinical scenario and gave them 10 minutes to discuss it. You have to then make sure that one of the people within each breakout room is allocated in advance as the spokesperson, and is prepared to talk. And then that made it much more interactive, because then when we were debriefing, you could have a discussion with that one person and the others could add things on chat. So that worked really well. I have to say I ran out of time, as I always do, and I had to apologize for that and offer to follow up a bit like we're doing now.
I would add to that as well, Mark, because I've done live demonstrations. So it was a demonstration of coaching methods. Again, it was on a master's level course. what we did was we made sure that everybody had their videos off, which is often counter to what I encourage. If it's about 30 or 40 people, you can have video on, and then you can see faces, you can see if they're falling asleep. We can't do that today, sadly. But anyway, we had videos off unless that other than the person who was demonstrating coaching and the person being coached. And we gave them a task, we gave them a structured observation task. So we asked them to look and note down in particular the questions that the coach asked, any point that they had where they noticed that there was a kind of change in the nature of the conversation, any ideas that the person being coached generated as a response to their own problem. And I think you could, with clinical teaching, you could, with permission of the student, you probably have to set it up beforehand, but you could do the akin to demonstrations. We often kind of feel like, oh, we've got to show slides, but actually show yourself, show interaction with a student. You could have an interaction with a patient if you'd discussed and got proper consent up front. You can then get them to respond.
Yeah, and I think the key thing is, as you said, it doesn't have to be slides, and the use of video resources like speaking clinically, patient voice, if you're going to break into small groups, and I would encourage use of breakout rooms, be aware you need to be very clear with the group before you break them out. What is the task? What are the questions that are going to be that need to be answered? Because once you're in a breakout group, they can't see slides, so you need to preempt that if you're using breakout groups. But actually, in my experience, again, a bit like Claire, I've not done 400, but just in the couple of hundreds, it can work really well, particularly if you've got some key questions. It breaks up the session regularly and picks up with the next question. Is an hour too long? An hour, I certainly think, is too long if it's just you talking. At Zoom, I think, is quite draining if you're doing anything for more than about 10 minutes. So you need to be particularly careful about breaking up the session. And so I don't think an hour's too long if you break it up and you have a 10-minute aliquot of information, you break them into a group activity for 5 to 10 minutes, you bring it back, you share facilitation, you get somebody else to do a little bit for another 10 minutes. And certainly my experience with doing large groups is I found it a lot easier doing it where there's 2 or 3 of us who are working together. And in that situation, I don't think an hour is necessarily too long. Jeremy, you wanted to raise another point there.
Yeah, one of the things actually looking at the evaluation we've had from students is the sessions they really loved was one of the surgeons who doesn't like technology, who just did everything on a flip chart. And so I think we're all fixated on giving PowerPoint and death by PowerPoint. There's nothing worse. And I just thought I'd share this with you, which has just arrived today, is a portable flip chart called a giant post-it, which I thought Mark would be particularly pleased with. This was 26 quid from Amazon, and you can put it on your desk. It's cardboard with some paper, so you can actually use a giant flip chart inside, put it on the desk and put the camera towards it and draw things or scroll things up.
And then a useful tip that somebody's just put up, linking with how you get people engaged with things. Yes, the chat function is visible when you're in the room. So actually posting task instructions on the chat before going to breakout rooms is a useful thing to do. Claire.
I'm just going to comment again on the thing about interaction. We get very hooked on interaction with us and even then interaction with each other. But, you know, let's not underestimate the importance of students interacting with their own thoughts and ideas, and to allow that quiet space, either to set up a quiz, to pose a question, to ask them just to spend 3 minutes thinking quietly and writing some notes about what has gone before, that we know that actually that kind of chunking and thinking is really important for learning. And sometimes I think we get a little too hung up on what we're doing and not enough on what they're doing. And as long as it's structured, you've got clear signposting, and I think you're explicit about your method. In a minute, I'm going to give you 3 minutes to sit quietly and to write some notes, or here's a question for you, or here's a quiz for you, and it kind of consolidates, or it might activate their thinking for the next bit of information you're going to share with them. So I always think interaction with data, with their own thoughts and ideas, with each other and with the teacher. There's 4 different ways that you can do that in large group teaching, and I think all of those with different platforms you can facilitate.
and you can get information then back from that by using polling functions that's embedded in some learning platforms like Zoom. You can get information back with things like Mentimeter by using Slido. So you can then get information back from that. So they're all ways of enabling students, as you say, to interact with their own thinking and their own sort of cognitive processes. In terms of which platforms to use, I guess it's dependent on people's experiences. My experiences have mainly been with Zoom for large group teaching. I've used Teams for small group teaching. I haven't used Teams for anything apart from a sort of broadcast webinar with a large group, and I don't have experience with Starleaf. But other people may have other thoughts. Personally, I find Zoom quite helpful for being able to share videos, share slides, sharing screen very effectively, and it seems to work well, particularly in my experience, for sharing videos from things like speaking clinically, so that I can share those kind of clinical resources with students. And that sort of links in with a previous question that was sent in before the session about what is people's experience of sharing moving images. The question was particularly related to radiology teaching, but I think it can be a challenge. I haven't had that issue with the videos I've been sharing, but if people have experiences of platforms that are particularly good for sharing high resolution images like in radiology, do add it to the chat function, because that would be beneficial. And I think, as somebody's just pointed out, all of these platforms are developing new functionality as time goes on. Zoom's introduced different security functionality to make it more acceptable for NHS trusts. Teams are developing more functionality for their platform. So these things are going to evolve, and particularly looking at the academic year ahead, I think we'll find the technology that's there to support us progressively increases in its complexity, which will have pros and cons.
Yeah. One of the panelists, one of the attendees, Plutarco, is asking about the maximum numbers of learners you can teach with Zoom. Zoom has got various different types of licenses. So I think you can have up to 400 or even 500 people if you have a license that you run more as a webinar. And I think you can even have gallery views with that. I've used Zoom a lot to do faculty development with dentists over the past few months, and that's teaching for up to 6 hours a day using it. And just a really simple thing, once you go beyond 24, you can't see everybody's face on the screen, so you have to start flipping between screens. And it is doable. It can be a little bit disconcerting, but one of the things is just, I always, when I'm using Zoom, do a training, a tiny micro teach at the beginning, and get people to test out how they use it. So I get everybody cameras on, I get everybody cameras off, I get everybody putting their hand up, I get everybody to put something in the chat. So rather than just assuming that because I've told them they know how to do it, and if you're co-facilitating, if you find that somebody isn't managing, then that your other facilitator can have a little kind of off on the side discussion with them, because I think it's sometimes we make too many assumptions and we're so keen to get into the content that we don't actually help people get familiar with the learning environment. And just because we've been using it all the time, that doesn't mean somebody else has. There's some interesting commentary going on about Teams and its increased functionality. I haven't enjoyed using it for teaching, but I know that when I've done some work in the NHS, it's been difficult because people have been told they're not allowed Zoom on their computers, they have to use Teams. So we have found some workarounds, but I think, as Mark says, there are workarounds, and I think over time things will get better. Because there are other platforms as well.
There's one practical point somebody's just raising about our chat. I think if you raise a chat, if you just make sure that you send the chat to all panelists and attendees, then everybody can see your question. If you just leave it to the default, which is apparently to all panelists, Claire, Jeremy and myself can see all the chat, but you potentially, the rest of you can't necessarily see the questions. There's a question that's come in: do you think you need to pre-allocate groups before you begin the session? You can do, it's hard work. If you're delivering a big, large group session, I would argue it's not worth the effort. But if you're dealing with 200-300 people, you don't want to pre-allocate. But you can create breakout rooms of any size that you want with the delegates that you've got. And you have a choice. After you get them back, you can keep them in the same group, or you can shake them up every time you split them into a breakout room. So certainly on Zoom, you have that opportunity, but to pre-allocate, certainly within Zoom, more than about 20 people is a lot of work. I don't know, people who've used Teams and Starleaf with big groups might find it a little bit easier. Jeremy, you want to come in?
I think Claire's probably done this now, and she's got a hand up as well. But if you're going to pre-allocate, I think you have to do it at the time of setting up the meeting, and you need a spreadsheet with the names of your attendees on it, with their emails they're going to use, and then it can divide them up. We use the one of the things I did last week was with a group of 40, was we had scenarios and had to allocate them into group 1 to 5. So you did have to pre-allocate, but in fact, what happened was my co-facilitator, who was one of the administrators, actually did that in the back, on the back burner whilst I was talking. So you can't do it on your own, but you need, if you've got somebody who can help you.
I was going to say exactly the same, but also go back to learning principles. Why do you want to pre-allocate? So you might want to pre-allocate because it's important they work in a certain peer group. So sometimes we pre-allocate to put people in tutor groups. So because we're actually bringing their tutors to work with them in breakout rooms. So we've got stuff going on in parallel. You might want to do a task, for example. So, sorry, my examples will always be medical education, but you might want to get them to think about how you teach in different clinical settings. So you might want to put the surgeons and the anaesthetists in one group because they teach in theatre. You might want to have GPs who teach in the consultation in another room, which means you'd have to kind of know your students. But I think the key thing is to think about, why am I doing this? Why do I want to pre-allocate or otherwise? How does it add value to the learning? And then and if you do think it adds value to the learning, then it's worth the effort. Because I think pre-allocation is a bit of a nightmare, not least if somebody drops out and then you have somebody hanging around in a waiting room that you've got to reallocate to a room, and it just all can get a little bit clunky. So absolutely, if you've got somebody to help co-facilitate, that helps smooth it out. But go back to learning principles, think, why am I doing? What's the value added of having them in groups and in particular groups? And that can help. And sometimes you get a weird thing that you get students who are sharing one camera, and then you just get into a pickle. Because I had 3 dentists from the same practice doing the same webinar, so I couldn't allocate them. We've had married couples that are in different tutor groups, but they were on one computer. We couldn't pre-allocate them. So I just think there's some real practical things depending on the size of the group.
So we've looked at a few key areas so far. So we've thought a little bit about how the scholarship can inform this, and that sort of key question we keep coming back to you. Why do we want to do this? What are we trying to do in terms of providing high quality learning for our students by whatever we are doing? We've thought a bit about the process element. So we've thought about, how are we going to use breakout rooms? How are we going to break up a session? Not doing a whole hour on your own, thinking about using facilitators. And one of the advantages of a lot of this large group remote teaching is it does give us an opportunity to redesign our large group teaching. Lots of us probably have got into the habit, well, we'll turn up and we'll do the same lecture that we've done for the past 15 years. But actually, the remote stuff is challenging us to rethink these things. And so there are lots of process elements that the literature can help us with to improve things. We've thought a bit about the technology. So we've done the scholarship, we've done the process, we've looked at the technology. Pros and cons of different platforms. They're going to change, they're going to evolve. I think, as has been picked up a little bit in the chat, you may be restricted, particularly if you're teaching in an NHS environment, which platform that you use. And some trusts will be happy with Zoom and some will not, and some will prefer Teams and some will prefer Starleaf. And really, you're going to have to adapt your large group sessions somewhat around the technology that you can use. We've shared a little bit about our own experiences. I would stress there are experiences, they're the lessons that we've learned from trial and error. They're not there to say that, you know, they are the correct answer to everything, but they're the sort of 4 or 5 key areas that we've picked up on so far. We've got, does anybody want to answer Claire's challenge that she sent out to you? It'd be great to hear your top tips, because actually we'd love to learn from you a little bit more. Here in Cambridge, we've tried to put together some top tips about what we've learned in what we call virtual medical education. Virtual medical education, or VME, will be available open access, will be available as a series of resources looking at how can we use remote technology to support small group teaching, large group teaching, bedside teaching, how can we use interactive elements, how can we use whiteboards and things. So they will all be available, and we can circulate a link to that round after this session with any additional comments from this. We'll wait, we'll have a bit of silence and to see if anyone's got any great ideas as to tips that they would be prepared to share.
I was wondering if people, I was just going to say if people would like to answer the second question I had set up on Slido, which is, we've had what, half an hour, if that, 40 minutes, but I'm just, if your position on it is changing, just so I can demonstrate the value of doing kind of before and at the end of session questions. The question is now, how do you feel about facilitating remote lectures now? It's okay to feel more terrified. Often the more we think about things, the more overwhelming they become. Maybe that's just me who's planning a move. But a tad more confident. That's brilliant. Yeah. So have a go at it.
I'm enjoying the comment that we should, I'm not sure if that's directed at us, that we should curate our background. As you say, one of the problems with virtual backgrounds like the ASME background that we've got is it does distort things slightly. I agree. It's quite interesting looking at different people's bookshelves during lectures, so you can provide some entertainment for your students with the judicious use of props on bookshelves in the background.
I think there's something really important we haven't quite touched upon, is just to be thinking about, so if you are using a platform that allows students to be seen and invites them to be seen, is we just, I think we just need to be thoughtful about that as facilitators, because in a sense we're inviting ourselves into their homes often. They may not have an environment that they want actually other people to peer into their worlds. They may not actually have the best spaces and technology. So there's a worry for me around some of this, is that as we gung-ho go forward, that we kind of forget about the fact that it could create further inequalities in terms of the educational experience. And so sometimes it might be our preference would be for this, but we just need to remind ourselves, why are we asking that? Whose benefit is it for? So we can invite but not insist, for example. Jeremy, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, something that we've done actually, because in fact one of the bits of evaluation we got from the students is they got fed up with everybody telling them how to use Zoom every single time, which I still think you need to do. But in fact, what we've now done is we've written a very brief document that we sent to all of them saying, the sessions are going to be taught on Zoom. These are what we would like you to do. So we've said if it's groups of under 20, we like them to have cameras on, but mute audio. If it's groups of over 20, then it may be that we have to have cameras off, but they might be invited to put cameras on. And also about using the chat facility for asking questions, and how we will try not to put them on the spot by asking questions to them directly.
Mark, there's a question from Kalman I thought was worth drawing attention to, which is about about how to combine asynchronous and synchronous learning, so you get the most from live sessions. And I think that's really a really important question. It's certainly on the Masters and PG Dip we've thought about a lot. And so one of the things is, the feedback is people felt that on our PG Cert that actually sometimes we were a bit too keen to whip them out of the breakout rooms, that as professional learners they wanted more time to talk to each other and share ideas and develop ideas. And it's a bit back to, what does it offer that the textbooks can't? And I do think it's worth thinking not to automatically default to, well, I'm just going to go into delivery mode, but actually, if I've got this opportunity to have the students live with me, how can I make this the richest learning opportunity for them? And what would they need to do before, or what would the follow-up be, and how do I signpost them and prep them? And I know, Jeremy, you give your students things to watch, but you give them things to watch with some primers for when you watch this video, think about X, Y, and Z, and then you bring that in and you discuss the X, Y, and Z. You don't pretend it never happened.
Yeah, so we give them advanced organisers with most things. So, and we actually, for the PG cert, we're going to warn them that we're doing that to get them used to it. So try and model that as good behaviour.
Nice.
And there's a few great tips coming through in terms of co-facilitators, in terms of imagining that you are just talking to a single person. So the other thing to think about linking with that is actually sometimes it's useful being in a large group teaching mode. And certainly I've done large group sessions where I'm not on screen, but I stand up because I feel more comfortable with that sort of large group environment. And the didactic type content, having that second moderator can be quite useful there. I'm just going to see if I can invite somebody to join us a second.
One of the things, Mark, you say when you're standing up, do you have your camera on when you're standing up, or do you have camera off?
Camera off, always camera off.
So one of the things somebody taught me recently was actually don't feel that you have, when you're presenting, you have to have the camera on the whole time. It can actually be distracting if your little face is at the top right-hand corner for other people viewing it. But it's particularly difficult if you are recording something to look at yourself. That's a bit grim. So certainly that would be, when I then learned that was okay, that made life a lot easier.
So Linda, you made a very interesting point earlier about you've been doing some work with actors about how to use a camera. Did you want to say a little bit more about that, because that sounded fascinating, that we could all learn from that, I think.
Yes, it's been great fun actually. I happen to be a stand-up comedian as well as a GP, and the whole comedy community has obviously had to move online, and they've got some great tips about how to use that space. But the main thing is to look at the camera, work out where the camera is on your device, because most of us are looking at the screen rather than at the camera.
Yes.
And then to use your proximity, you know, whether you're coming up close to the camera or further away, to add a bit of variety and not sit there rigidly all the time, really. But they've also, I've worked with a psychotherapist who does a lot of body work, and she's pointed out that you're staring at a computer screen, you're in a very hunched position. It's important to encourage people to look out beyond the screen and be aware of the space behind you as well as in front of you, so that you're not sitting there for 8 hours a day staring at that screen. So we can learn a lot from other professions, I think.
Yes, yeah, no, I think that comment about how do you use the camera is really important, because we do tend to all look down, looking at the images as opposed to looking at the person's face through the camera.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us. I'm just going to pick up, there was a really interesting question about how can you evaluate whether learning has taken place. And Jeremy, I think you've got some useful tips there for how do we evaluate whether learning has taken place, in terms of how do you close a session?
So I think at the end of a session, I will often, if it's a small group session, I will actually just do what I would do in a small group session. And instead of writing it on a post-it note, or I'll get them to do a round of one thing they've picked up and one thing that they want to go and think more about. A larger group session, I would probably get them to do that. And I think actually at the moment, practically, you probably have to do that on chat and explain to them why you're doing it. And also ask them for their feedback on how the teaching's gone. I mean, my advantage has been that I've been working with a tutorial group of 10, the same 2 groups every week for the last 8 to 10 weeks. And that's easier because you then get some immediate feedback from people that feel comfortable talking to you. In a bigger group, it's much more difficult. And we actually asked them very specific questions and set it up by saying that we were all learning and we were trying to improve their teaching, and what did they think worked well and what didn't work well. And then tell the next group what the previous group had said.
And certainly a learning management system has advantages from that point of view. in that you can follow up with information in terms of, well, what was the key learning that you got out of this session. You can use things like Mentimeter and Slido. I say the key thing to evaluate in my experience is it's very easy to do a poll of did you enjoy this or not, but that doesn't really give you much useful information about the learning. But actually getting somebody to articulate what are the 2 or 3 key messages that you're taking away from this is a really helpful way of evaluating things. And you can use, as I say, things like Slido and Mentimeter to get that information. You can use the chat function, particularly if you're recording a session like this one, because then you can go back and have a look in terms of what was put there. Or, as I say, in a learning management system, you can do that separately, and that would be one of the advantages of that.
And I think it's a massive question, and it's a webinar in its own right. But
yes.
Sometimes we're very keen to kind of capture at the immediate end. If you've got a continuing relationship with students, I'd be thinking about the questions you ask them the next time you see them. So you can ask them questions at the beginning related to the previous lecture, because that primes them, it gets them more ready. There's a very nice there's a range of ways in which you can ask questions, as we said, in things like Slido and Mentimeter. I mean, even something really simple, if I just show you the Slido that we've done, and it's so rough and ready, and it doesn't really tell you anything, although we were asking about feelings. So I was curious to know how people felt. So this, what Slido does is a word cloud. So obviously the bigger the letter, the words, the more emphasis that you get. But that was at the beginning. So excited, nervous, interested, anxious, and this time we've got confidence and excitement. And again, there's fewer numbers, but it can be interesting. I've used this with kind of feeling kind of stuff with a huge group of newly qualified dentists, and that was fascinating because some of the words that came up there I wasn't expecting, and it gave us an opportunity to unpack and explore some of those words in the session. But I think evaluation in itself is quite complex.
Yeah. But I think the great thing with things like Slido is, coming back to the comment that you made earlier, you're actually accessing a little bit about how the student themselves is interacting with their thinking and their feelings, and it's a really helpful way to evaluate things. I'm aware that we've been going for 45 minutes. We could probably carry on the conversation all evening, but I'm going to draw things to a close. Thank you for sharing the Slido. Thank you to Claire and to Jeremy for their input. Thank you to Linda for very kindly joining us to share a bit about your discussions with actors. In terms of this session, it has been recorded. We will, the ASME office will be putting this up online, and there'll be a link to that circulated in the next few days. I think we've answered pretty much all of the questions. We may look through the chat to see about useful tips that people have mentioned that we can pull together a little bit. There's another bite-sized session. So the next bite-sized session is next Tuesday with Nisha Dogra and Ria George, which is the second part of a discussion on the challenges of diversity for medical education. And it would be worthwhile before that session, if you're interested in that, looking at Nisha's sessions that she did 3-4 weeks ago to give you a bit of background to that. As I say, we'll try and put together a little tip summary from things that people have raised. We hope that you found that useful. Thank you for giving up your time. Thank you for joining us. We hope you found that a useful and interesting session.
Thanks, folks.
Bye, everyone.